The ancient woods of the Pacific Northwest breathed a deep, resonant hush, a silence so profound it felt like a living entity, absorbing every whisper of the wind, every rustle of dry leaves. Yet, beneath this seemingly impenetrable quiet, a different sound often pierced the air, a primeval echo that seemed to well up from the very bedrock of the earth. It wasn't the shriek of a hawk, nor the growl of a bear, but something far more unsettling, a note of raw, untamed wilderness that sent shivers down the spine of anyone unfortunate enough to hear it. This particular evening, as twilight bled into the dense canopy, that sound, a low, guttural moan, reverberated through the towering firs and moss-draped cedars, carrying with it an unmistakable sense of ancient longing, or perhaps warning. Ethan, a man whose life was inextricably woven into the fabric of these forests, felt it even before he consciously registered the sound. It was a familiar sensation, a prickling awareness at the back of his neck, a subtle shift in the forest's energy that spoke of unseen eyes. For a seasoned wildlife biologist like him, such feelings were not uncommon, often attributed to the heightened senses developed through years of solitary observation. Yet, tonight, it felt different. It carried a weight, a certain undeniable premonition that settled like a cold stone in his gut. He was, by nature, a man of science, driven by data and empirical evidence, but even he couldn't deny the profound intuition that often guided him through the wild heart of America. His secluded cabin, a humble sanctuary he'd built with his own calloused hands, stood nestled deep within a remote national forest, a place so far off the beaten path that most maps simply labeled it unexplored. For Ethan, this isolation was not a hardship, but a necessity, a spiritual anchor for a soul that thrived on the untainted pulse of nature. His only constant companion was Ranger, a magnificent German shepherd whose intelligence and loyalty were as boundless as the wilderness surrounding them. Ranger, too, had heard the sound. His ears were perked, his powerful body poised, a low, almost imperceptible rumble emanating from his chest. His amber eyes, usually soft and keen, now held a deep, unreadable intensity, fixed on the impenetrable curtain of trees beyond the cabin's small window. Ethan recalled the words of Old Man Hemlock, a grizzled trapper who had lived in these mountains since before Ethan was born. The old man, whose eyes held the wisdom of countless forgotten seasons, had warned him repeatedly, "There be things in these woods, boy, older than the trees themselves, things that walk on two legs, but ain't human. You leave 'em be, and they'll leave you be. Cross 'em, and you'll find out what true fear feels like." Ethan had always dismissed it as campfire tales, the rambling superstitions of a bygone era. He believed in ecological balance, in the delicate dance of predator and prey, but not in mythical beasts. Still, Hemlock's words, delivered with such an unnerving conviction, lingered in his mind like the scent of pine smoke. The next morning, the forest had fallen back into its usual, deceptive tranquility. The unusual sound from the night before was a distant memory, almost a dream. Ethan, accompanied by a still edgy ranger, set out on his routine patrol, checking camera traps and monitoring wildlife activity. His path led him to a rarely visited section of the forest, an expanse of ancient growth known for its eerie quiet and the occasional, unexplained absence of animal life. As they moved deeper, Ranger began to pull against his leash, nose to the ground, sniffing with an almost frantic urgency. Then Ethan saw them. Embedded in the damp earth near a trickling stream was a series of impressions unlike anything he had ever encountered. They were massive, far larger than any bear print, yet unmistakably bipedal. The heel strike was pronounced, the toes splayed in a way that mimicked a human foot, but scaled up to an impossible degree. The stride indicated an immense power and weight. Ethan knelt, his trained eye examining every detail. There was no sign of claws, only the clear impression of a broad, flat foot. He traced the outline with a gloved finger, a chill creeping up his spine despite the morning sun. He tried to rationalize it. A peculiar erosion pattern? A prankster with oversized, custom-made boots? A trick of the dappled light filtering through the canopy, distorting the size and shape? He took out his field camera, snapping several photographs, meticulously measuring the prints against his own boot. The evidence, stark and undeniable, contradicted every logical explanation his scientific mind could conjure. This was not a hoof, not a paw. It was a foot, impossibly large, impossibly human-like, yet definitively not human. He considered the sheer amount of force required to leave such deep impressions in the compacted soil. This creature, whatever it was gargantuan. Ranger let out a low growl, a sound of profound unease that Ethan rarely heard from his usually fearless companion. The dog was staring intently into the dark undergrowth, his hackles slightly raised. Ethan scanned the dense foliage, seeing nothing but shadows in the endless green tapestry of the forest. Yet the feeling of being watched intensified, a palpable pressure on his back, a silent presence that seemed to absorb all warmth from the air. He felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to leave, to retreat from this place and never look back. The prints and the feeling they evoked were a direct challenge to his ordered world, an intrusion of the truly unknown into his carefully catalogued reality. Dismissing his growing apprehension as an overactive imagination, a byproduct of too much solitude, and old man Hemlock's persistent folklore, Ethan slowly backed away from the prints. He told himself it was a hoax, an elaborate trick played by some local teenagers. It had to be. Anything else was simply impossible. He refused to entertain the whispers of a world beyond scientific comprehension, a world where creatures of myth walked among the trees. Yet, as he turned to leave, he cast one last glance at the prints, and a cold certainty settled over him. This was no prank. This was a track left by something ancient, powerful, and very much real. Before we dive deeper into Ethan's encounter and the astonishing events that will unravel in this secluded corner of the world, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss out on more gripping stories, revelations, and the truth hidden beneath the canopy of our wildest imaginations. Your support helps us bring these incredible tales to life. The unsettling quiet that had settled over Ethan's secluded patch of forest after the initial discovery of the colossal tracks began to unravel. What had once been a familiar, comforting silence, punctuated only by the calls of birds or the rustling of wind through ancient pines, now felt charged with an unseen presence. He noticed subtle shifts, almost imperceptible at first, around his remote camp. A small stack of firewood, diligently piled, would be slightly disarranged, not scattered, but as if someone had idly sifted through it. A canvas tarp, meticulously secured, might have one corner flapping loose, despite no significant wind. He initially chalked it up to deer, or perhaps a bear, but the patterns didn't quite fit the usual animal behavior he'd spent decades observing. Then came the disappearances. Minor things at first. A handful of dried fruit from an airtight container left outside to cool, a single fishing lure from his tackle box, or a small portion of trail mix he'd forgotten on his porch. Nothing substantial enough to warrant alarm, yet too consistent to be dismissed as mere forgetfulness. Ranger, his loyal tracking dog, A German shepherd, with an uncanny sense for the woods, became increasingly agitated. He would stand at the edge of the cabin's clearing, hackles raised, a low, rumbling growl emanating from his chest, his gaze fixed on the dense tree line. Ethan would follow his line of sight, seeing nothing but shadows and foliage. Yet the dog's persistence spoke volumes. Ranger, usually a placid and confident creature, now seemed perpetually on edge, his protective instincts in overdrive. He'd often position himself between Ethan and the forest, a silent, furry sentinel against an invisible threat. The howls started a few nights later. They were unlike anything Ethan had ever heard in all his years in the wilderness. Not the mournful cry of a wolf, nor the eerie hoot of an owl, nor the territorial bellow of a bear. These were guttural, primal sounds, resonating with a deep, almost human quality, carrying across the valleys with an unnerving power. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously, echoing off the ancient mountains and settling deep into the quiet darkness. Ethan, a man who prided himself on his scientific detachment and rational explanations, found himself listening to them from the safety of his cabin, a knot of unease tightening in his stomach. Ranger would whine softly, pressing against Ethan's leg, his body trembling. Determined to understand what was disturbing his sanctuary, Ethan intensified his patrols, venturing further off the established game trails, pushing deeper into the uncharted parts of the forest he called home. He moved with the quiet grace of a seasoned woodsman. Ranger, a silent shadow at his heels. Days blurred into a focused search, his binoculars sweeping through the dense undergrowth, his ears straining for any unnatural sound. It was on one particularly overcast afternoon, deep within a section of old-growth forest rarely visited by humans, that he stumbled upon it. Hidden beneath a thick canopy of cedar and fir, partially obscured by fallen logs and moss-covered boulders, was a trap. But this was no ordinary trap. It was a snare, fashioned with frightening ingenuity and strength. A thick, braided steel cable, disguised with leaves and dirt, was cinched around a pressure plate, connected to a heavy-duty spring mechanism anchored to a colossal ancient tree trunk. The loop of the snare was wide, easily capable of encircling something far larger than a deer, even a black bear. It was a trap designed not just to capture, but to hold something with immense power and size. And it was clearly set by human hands. A cold dread crept up Ethan's spine, a stark contrast to the humid forest air. This wasn't the work of a recreational hunter, nor a casual poacher. The precision, the sheer engineering behind it, spoke of a calculated, almost sinister intent. Who would set such a device? And for what creature? His mind raced through possibilities, none of them comforting. Poachers targeting grizzlies? But even grizzlies were rare in this specific region, and this trap seemed excessive. It felt designed for something mythical, something that shouldn't exist. He approached cautiously, Ranger bristling beside him. A low growl, now a constant undercurrent. Ethan knelt, examining the mechanism. The craftsmanship was crude in its appearance, but terrifyingly effective in its design. The trigger was sensitive, the cable thick enough to withstand incredible force. He tried to disarm it, but the spring was too powerful, the securing pins too complex without proper tools. He tugged at the cable, testing its strength, and felt the unyielding rigidity. Dismantling it right then and there was impossible without risking injury or, worse, accidentally setting it off. A new, gnawing sense of responsibility settled over him. This wasn't just about his disturbed camp anymore. This was something far more dangerous. He couldn't leave it. Someone, or something, could be grievously harmed. He pulled back, a new plan forming. He would monitor it. He would set up his discreet trail cameras, not just to identify the perpetrator, but to understand what they were after. Perhaps, if he was lucky, he would catch the poachers in the act, prevent them from claiming their malevolent prize. He carefully marked the location in his GPS, making sure to approach and retreat from different angles to avoid leaving a discernible trail. He retreated silently. The image of the brutal snare burned into his mind, an ominous harbinger of the unknown that lurked beneath the ancient canopy. The forest, once his sanctuary, now felt like a stage set for a terrifying drama. The forest, usually a symphony of rustling leaves and distant bird calls, began to groan under the weight of an approaching storm. Ethan huddled in his cabin, watched as the mighty pines outside swayed violently, their branches thrashing like desperate arms against a darkening sky. Rain started, hesitant at first, then unleashing itself in a relentless, blinding deluge that turned the world outside into a watercolor blur. The wind howled, a primeval cry that seemed to rip through the very fabric of the landscape. Ranger, usually stoic, paced restlessly, his hackles slightly raised, a low, continuous growl rumbling deep in his chest. Ethan tried to reassure him, stroking his fur, but the dog remained on edge, his gaze fixed on the cabin door as if expecting some unseen threat to burst through. Then, piercing through the cacophony of the storm, a sound ripped the air that froze Ethan's blood. It wasn't the shriek of the wind, nor the crash of a falling tree. It was guttural, raw, a sound of agony and primal terror that seemed to vibrate deep within his bones. It was impossibly loud, impossibly close, and undeniably originated from the direction of the monstrous trap he had discovered. Ranger let out a sharp, frantic bark, a sound unlike any Ethan had ever heard from him, and lunged for the door, scratching at the wood with desperate claws. Without a second thought, Ethan grabbed his heavy-duty rain gear and a powerful headlamp. The civilized part of his brain screamed at him to stay put, to let nature take its course. But the sheer, unadulterated suffering in that sound propelled him forward. The trap, he realized with chilling certainty, had claimed a victim. And Ranger's urgency, his pure, unbridled distress, told Ethan that this was no ordinary animal in peril. He burst out into the raging tempest. The rain lashed at him horizontally, blinding him despite the headlamp. The wind tried to tear the coat from his body, and the ground was rapidly turning into a treacherous quagmire of mud and slick roots. Ranger, unfazed by the elements, led the way, his barks no longer frantic but purposeful, guiding Ethan through the near impenetrable darkness. Every few steps, Ethan stumbled, his boots sinking into the saturated earth. But the image of that crude, sinister trap, now surely holding something, spurred him on. The guttural cries continued, interspersed with whimpers that tore at his heart, raw and desolate, a sound of complete and utter despair. It felt like an eternity, every inch a battle against the storm's fury, before Ranger skidded to a halt, letting out a series of short, sharp yelps. Ethan, catching up, shone his headlamp through the swirling rain and gasping wind. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating a scene that would forever shatter his understanding of the world. There, caught in the brutal tangle of thick ropes and hidden mechanisms, was a figure that defied every scientific textbook he had ever read, every rational explanation he had ever accepted. It was massive, easily 9 feet tall, covered in thick, dark brown fur that was matted and glistening with rain. Its powerful limbs thrashed weakly against the restraints, but the trap held firm, biting deep into one massive leg. The creature's head was thrown back, and from its wide, open mouth emanated the chilling screams that had drawn him here. It was undeniably humanoid, yet undeniably not human. And then, through the pain and the fear, its eyes met his. They were enormous, dark, and intelligent. Not the mindless fear of an animal, but the profound, agonizing terror of a sentient being. In that instant, every doubt, every scientific dismissal, every logical explanation Ethan had ever constructed crumbled into dust. This was a female. He could tell from her slightly softer features, the way her powerful chest heaved with labored breaths, the almost maternal protectiveness in the way she tried to shield her injured leg. Her cries softened to whimpers, her struggles becoming more desperate, fueled by renewed terror at the sight of him. But in the depths of her pain-filled eyes, Ethan also perceived something else. A flicker of understanding, a desperate plea for help. It was a silent, agonizing recognition that pierced through his scientific training, through his ingrained skepticism, and directly into his soul. He stood there, drenched and trembling, not from the cold or the storm, but from the sheer, overwhelming impossibility of the moment. Before him was not a myth, not a legend, but a living, breathing creature, intelligent and suffering, caught in a human-made instrument of torture. The magnitude of this discovery, the implications it held for science, for humanity, for everything he thought he knew, crashed down on him. But in that torrential downpour, under the piercing gaze of those ancient, intelligent eyes, his immediate concern wasn't for the scientific revelation, but for the profound, undeniable suffering of the magnificent being before him. He had to help her. He had to free her. The thought was not a choice, but an imperative, an undeniable command from the deepest part of his being. The creature, the female Bigfoot, looked at him, and in her eyes he recognized a mirror of his own dawning realization. Their worlds had just irrevocably collided. The storm raged around them, but in that moment, only the primal connection between rescuer and rescued existed. Ethan stared, completely transfixed by the raw agony contorting her features, the primal fear flickering in her deep-set eyes. His mind, usually a fortress of scientific method and rational thought, was utterly shattered. The textbooks, the lectures, the years of academic rigor, all dissolved in the face of this undeniable reality. This wasn't a hoax, nor was it a misidentification. This was a sentient being, clearly female, trapped, bleeding, and looking at him with an intelligence that transcended species barriers. The profound scientific disbelief that had been his bedrock for so long crumbled, leaving him exposed to a truth far more startling than any theory. He felt a sickening lurch in his stomach, a mixture of awe and profound responsibility. The sheer scale of her suffering, evident in every strained muscle and every desperate whimper, was overwhelming. He saw not a monster, but a victim, and an intelligent one at that. His own fear, which had initially paralyzed him, began to recede, replaced by a surge of something far more potent, a deep, aching empathy. He knew he couldn't leave her. The moral imperative was overwhelming, echoing in his chest with the force of a tribal drum. Ranger, sensing the shift in Ethan's demeanor, stopped his frantic barking and stood beside him, a low, concerned whine rumbling in his throat. The rain lashed down, soaking Ethan to the bone, but he barely noticed the cold. His focus narrowed entirely on the injured creature. He had to act, and he had to act now. "It's okay," he murmured, his voice hoarse, though he knew she couldn't understand his words. His tone, however, was filled with a desperate calmness, an attempt to project reassurance into the terrifying situation. He took a hesitant step closer, then another, his eyes never leaving hers. She flinched, pulling back her head as much as the snare would allow, a fresh wave of whimpers escaping her. But she didn't thrash with the same panicked force as before, perhaps sensing something different in him, a lack of predatory intent. Ethan slowly knelt, carefully placing his headlamp on the wet ground to illuminate the intricate workings of the trap. It was indeed a brutal device, designed to hold something exceptionally strong. Thick, braided steel cables, camouflaged carefully, had sprung around her leg, cinching tighter with every struggle. The metal jaws were biting deep, and he could see a dark, sticky ooze staining her fur. Blood. He grimaced. Releasing this without causing further injury would be a monumental challenge, especially in the torrential downpour, with visibility limited and his hands already stiff with cold. He began to speak, not in sentences, but in a soothing, continuous murmur. "Easy, easy now. I'm going to help you. I won't hurt you." He moved, with deliberate slowness, extending his hand, palm up, towards her. She watched him, her eyes wide, glistening with rain and unshed tears. For a long moment she simply observed, her chest heaving, the air thick with tension. Then, incredibly, her gaze softened just a fraction. It was a silent acknowledgement, a fragile thread of trust offered in the heart of the storm. Drawing upon years of biological field experience, Ethan assessed the trap's mechanism. He couldn't just yank at it. He needed to understand how it was set to effectively disarm it. He noted the placement of the cam locks, the tension release points. This was no amateur job. The person who set this trap knew what they were doing, and they were hunting something big, something powerful, something they clearly didn't want to escape. The thought of confronting such a person later filled him with a cold dread, but right now, his singular focus was the creature in front of him. He pulled out his multi-tool, his fingers fumbling slightly in the cold, and tried to pry open one of the locking clamps. The metal was stiff, unyielding. He grunted with effort, the rain-slicked tool slipping in his grasp. The female Bigfoot watched his painstaking efforts, her whimpers subsiding to low grumbles of discomfort. Ethan talked to her throughout, narrating his actions, trying to keep her calm. "Just a little more, almost got it. Hold still, please. I need you to hold still." Hours seemed to pass in this torturous dance of rain, metal, and fur. His muscles ached, his hands were raw, and the cold was seeping into his bones. But with each small success, with every click of a loosened pin or released cable, a flicker of hope ignited. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he managed to disengage the main locking mechanism. With a final, agonizing pull, the steel jaws sprung open, releasing their cruel grip on her leg. A low moan of pure relief escaped her, a sound that resonated deep within Ethan. She slowly, carefully, began to pull her leg free. The wound was deep, gushing fresh blood, and she collapsed back onto the wet earth with a groan. Ethan quickly pulled out his emergency first aid kit, torn between wanting to tend to her wound and needing to create distance. Her sheer size and wildness, even injured, were still a potent reminder of the danger. He opted for distance, knowing she needed to heal away from human scent. She remained on the ground for a few moments, gathering her strength. Her powerful chest rose and fell with heavy breaths. Then, with a mighty, trembling effort, she pushed herself up onto her good legs. She swayed precariously, her injured leg dangling uselessly. Ethan watched, his heart pounding in his chest, ready to bolt if she showed any signs of aggression, but she didn't. Instead, she turned her head, her gaze sweeping over him once more. In that profound, rain-soaked moment, a deep, unspoken connection solidified between them. Her eyes, filled with a primal wisdom, held his for a long beat, an intensity that transcended language. It wasn't gratitude in a human sense, but a recognition, a knowing. Then, with a final, lingering look, she turned and limped away into the dense, rain-shrouded darkness of the forest, disappearing as silently as she had appeared. Ethan stood there, alone with Ranger, the storm raging around him, the echoes of her whimpers and his own frantic efforts still ringing in his ears. The world had irrevocably changed. Ethan stumbled back to his cabin, the storm's fury now a dull ache compared to the tempest raging within him. Ranger followed close, unusually quiet, sensing the profound shift in his master. Every step was heavy, not just with exhaustion, but with the weight of an impossible truth and an unimaginable choice. The image of those intelligent, suffering eyes was burned into his mind, eclipsing the roaring wind and the driving rain. He was no longer just Ethan, the wildlife biologist. He was Ethan, the man who had looked into the soul of a Bigfoot and saved her. The cabin offered little respite. The familiar scent of wood smoke and damp earth felt alien, tainted by the unbelievable events of the night. He peeled off his soaked clothing, his movements automatic, his mind replaying every agonizing second of the rescue. The grunts of pain, the immense power of her thrashing limbs, the delicate precision he'd needed to disarm the trap without causing further injury. It had taken hours, a desperate dance between adrenaline and meticulous care, all under the cover of the relentless downpour. She had watched him. He knew, her eyes never leaving his as he worked. A silent pact forged in the heart of the wilderness. And then, the moment of release. The soft sigh of relief, the tentative steps away, and that final, lingering glance back. A look that spoke volumes of gratitude, fear, and perhaps a deeper connection he couldn't yet comprehend. Sleep was impossible. He paced the small cabin, his thoughts a chaotic swirl of scientific dogma shattered, personal convictions validated, and a crushing fear of the unknown. Was he insane? Had the isolation, the relentless pursuit of elusive truths, finally broken his mind? He pinched himself, ran cold water over his face, stared into the flickering flame of the wood stove, seeking an anchor in reality. But the reality he had known was gone, replaced by something far more profound and terrifying. How could he explain this? To whom? His scientific colleagues would dismiss him. His friends would think him delusional. The very foundation of his life's work had been irrevocably altered, yet he couldn't speak a word of it. The secret was too enormous, too dangerous. A gnawing fear began to set in, a cold dread that had nothing to do with the storm or the creature, but with the men who had set the trap. Those sophisticated snares weren't the work of amateur hunters. They belonged to a darker, more organized enterprise. If they knew about her, if they had been tracking her, what would happen when they discovered their cruel trap had been sprung? What would happen when they realized their prey was gone? He shuddered, a premonition of danger settling deep in his bones. Protecting her, he now realized, meant protecting himself, and perhaps even his entire world. The first faint glimmer of dawn barely pierced the heavy clouds when the rhythmic thrumming began. It was a low, insistent vibration at first, barely perceptible, rising from the distant horizon. Ethan, still awake and staring blankly through his cabin window, felt it more than heard it. A deep resonance that vibrated through the very ground. Ranger, who had been dozing fitfully by the fire, suddenly rose, hackles bristling, and let out a low, ominous growl. The sound grew louder, stronger, coalescing into the unmistakable roar of military helicopters. Not one, but several, their powerful blades chopping through the morning air with an aggressive, purposeful rhythm. Ethan scrambled for his binoculars, his heart hammering against his ribs. He knew, with a sickening certainty, that this wasn't a routine training exercise. This was a hunt. He watched, breathless, as the dark silhouettes of unmarked helicopters descended, not far from where he had found the trap. Below them, on the forest floor, he began to see movement. Dozens of figures, clad in muted camouflage, fanning out with chilling efficiency. Unmarked vehicles, heavy-duty and purpose-built, traversed the rough terrain, their engines a low whine beneath the helicopter's din. They were sweeping the area, a meticulous, methodical search operation. His blood ran cold. They were looking for her. Through the powerful lenses, Ethan saw them deploy, a perfectly orchestrated ballet of human predation. They moved with a disturbing uniformity, a chilling lack of hesitation. K-9 units were unleashed, their handlers following close behind, guiding them with silent commands. Sections of the forest, once teeming with life, were now eerily still, silenced by the oppressive presence of the military. He held his breath, praying she had moved far enough away, praying she was safe. But then his gaze snagged on a cluster of activity, deeper within the tree line, near a small, rocky outcropping. The helicopters hovered lower, kicking up a whirlwind of leaves and debris. The camouflaged figures converged, forming a tight perimeter. And then, through the chaos, Ethan saw it. A large, dark shape, huddled against the rocks, trying desperately to conceal itself. It was unmistakable. It was her. His breath caught in his throat. A cold, crushing wave of despair washed over him. She was injured, vulnerable, and they had found her. He watched, helpless, as the figures closed in, nets poised, tranquilizer guns raised. The distance was too great to hear, but the scene unfolding before him was starkly clear. They had cornered her. The military had come, and the female Bigfoot he had risked everything to save was about to become their captive. The irony was a bitter taste in his mouth. He had freed her from one trap, only to inadvertently lead her into the clutches of a far more dangerous one. His heart sank, a heavy stone plunging into an abyss. The metallic clang of the helicopter's landing skids against the forest floor reverberated through Ethan's bones, a brutal counterpoint to the quiet desperation in his heart. Through the powerful lenses of his binoculars he watched, a silent, helpless observer to the unfolding nightmare. The camouflaged figures moved with a chilling efficiency, a practiced, almost surgical precision that spoke of extensive training and prior experience in such expeditions. They had not come unprepared. This was clearly not their first time. Nets, heavy and reinforced, shot from compressed air launchers, unfurling with sickening speed to envelop the injured female Bigfoot. She roared, a sound of profound anguish and fury that, even from his distant vantage point, made every hair on Ethan's neck stand on end. Her immense strength, though diminished by her previous injury and the fear of her pursuers, was still formidable. She tore at the netting, her powerful arms ripping through sections that would have held a lesser creature immobile. But their tactics were relentless, overwhelming. More nets followed, crisscrossing over her struggling form, tangling her limbs until her movements became increasingly restricted, desperate flails rather than purposeful resistance. Then came the tranquilizer darts, small, almost invisible projectiles, fired with pinpoint accuracy from specialized rifles. Ethan counted at least 5 impacts before her struggles began to wane. Her roars softened to guttural moans. Her thrashing became sluggish, uncoordinated. Her immense body, which had seemed an immovable force moments before, slowly, inevitably, began to yield to the drugs. She swayed, a colossal shadow against the dappled sunlight, before collapsing with a shuddering thud that seemed to shake the very earth beneath Ethan's feet. The forest, which had been alive with the frantic energy of the chase, fell into an unnatural, heavy silence, broken only by the whirring rotors of the still hovering helicopters and the clipped commands of the military personnel. Ethan's breath caught in his throat, a suffocating knot of despair. He felt a profound sense of violation, a sickening echo of the shame he had felt when he first found her in the trap. Now, she was ensnared by an even more sophisticated, more merciless kind of trap, one woven from human technology and an insatiable desire to control the unknown. He watched, his hands trembling so violently that the binoculars vibrated, making it difficult to focus. The military's movements were meticulously organized. A specialized team, equipped with heavy-duty lifting gear, moved in. They worked with a detached clinical efficiency, as if handling a particularly large, exotic animal. There was no awe, no fear, only the cold, hard focus of a mission being executed. They secured her unconscious form onto a massive, custom-built stretcher, clearly designed for just such a creature. Ropes and harnesses were expertly fastened, and with a coordinated effort, the colossal stretcher was winched slowly, agonizingly, into the belly of one of the helicopters. The cargo bay doors clanged shut with a finality that felt like a death knell for hope itself. While this was happening, another team was systematically scouring the surrounding area. They were equipped with advanced sensory devices, sweeping the ground, meticulously inspecting every leaf, every disturbed patch of earth. They picked up spent dart casings, wiped away any trace of blood or fur, as if sanitizing the very air of any evidence that such an extraordinary event had transpired. Ethan watched them erase her presence from the forest, erasing the very possibility of her existence. They left no stone unturned, no branch out of place that might betray the secret they had just seized. It was a complete, deliberate, and terrifyingly effective act of concealment. The ground teams then converged, swiftly boarding their unmarked vehicles. The helicopters lifted off in unison, their powerful downdraft whipping the trees into a frenzy, scattering leaves and debris in a final, symbolic act of disruption. They ascended quickly, shrinking into the vastness of the sky, until they were mere specks, then nothing at all. The forest slowly settled back into its usual, deceptive calm, as if the last hour had been an illusion, a nightmare conjured from thin air. But for Ethan, the nightmare was horribly, irrevocably real. A crushing guilt settled over him, heavy and suffocating. His act of kindness, his desperate, almost primal urge to free her from that cruel snare, had inadvertently led her directly into the hands of an even greater predator. He had saved her from one trap, only to deliver her into another, far more insidious one. He had believed he was acting out of empathy, out of a profound human connection to a suffering, sentient being. Now, he saw himself as a pawn, an unwitting accomplice in her capture. His anger simmered, a slow burn beneath the despair, directed not only at the faceless military but also, unfairly, at himself. He was powerless, utterly, completely powerless. He had witnessed a miracle, a living legend, and in his attempt to do good, he had sealed her fate. The profound connection he had felt with her, the unspoken understanding in her intelligent eyes, now felt like a betrayal. He had looked into those eyes and promised her freedom, and instead, he had led her to captivity. The weight of that realization was almost unbearable. He lowered the binoculars, his vision blurred, not by tears, but by a profound sense of loss and an overwhelming soul-deep despair. The silence of the forest, once a comfort, now felt like a shroud. The shroud of silence that had fallen upon the forest did not last. For Ethan, it was replaced by a relentless cacophony in his mind, a churning vortex of questions and desperate theories. He could not simply return to his life as a wildlife biologist, meticulously documenting migratory patterns or flora distribution. The world had irrevocably shifted on its axis. He had seen something impossible, something that shattered the very foundations of his scientific worldview. And then he had seen it stolen away by the forces of a government that vehemently denied its existence. This inconsistency, this monumental lie, gnawed at him. His immediate reaction was not academic curiosity, but a burning, protective rage. He had to know where she was, what they were doing to her. He began a discreet yet relentless search for answers. Leveraging his extensive network within the scientific community, he started making carefully worded inquiries. He phrased his questions with a deliberate vagueness, asking about unusual animal captures, specialized biological research facilities, or even unexplained military deployments in remote areas. The responses were, predictably, a wall of silence. Colleagues who usually prided themselves on transparent data sharing suddenly became evasive. Their voices hushed, their answers clipped. A few even offered thinly veiled warnings, advising him to stick to his own research and not chase shadows. The stonewalling was so uniform, so widespread, that it only fanned the flames of his conviction. He knew he was on the right track, precisely because they were trying so hard to dissuade him. He even risked reaching out to a former mentor, a crusty old professor with a penchant for conspiracy theories and an uncanny ability to connect obscure dots. The professor, usually eager to share his latest hypotheses on everything from alien abduction to secret government experiments, became uncharacteristically quiet. "Ethan," he'd said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, over the crackling phone line. "Some secrets are better left undisturbed. There are things out there, and forces that protect those things, that are far bigger than you or I. For your own safety, let this one go." The implied threat was clear, the fear in his mentor's voice palpable. It cemented Ethan's resolve. He was no longer just searching for information. He was engaged in a quiet war, a solitary insurgency against a vast, unseen power. Back in the forest, something else began to subtly shift. Despite the military's meticulous sweep, despite their technological prowess in erasing all traces, Ethan started noticing things, ephemeral signs almost imperceptible to the untrained eye, but glaringly obvious to his seasoned biologist's gaze. A faint indentation in the soft earth near his cabin, too large for a deer, too irregular for a bear. A branch broken at an unusual height, not snapped by wind or animal, but seemingly pushed aside by something immensely powerful. He would wake sometimes in the dead of night, not to Ranger's usual restless stirring, but to an unearthly stillness, a sensation of being watched that prickled the hairs on his neck. Ranger, too, exhibited peculiar behaviors. He would occasionally stand still, head cocked, ears swiveling, his low growl a barely audible tremor in his chest, directed not at squirrels or passing elk, but at the dense, undisturbed canopy. He wouldn't bark frantically, but rather with a deep, mournful whine, staring into the shadows as if seeing ghosts. Ethan realized it wasn't just a lingering presence he was sensing. It was an intelligence. They were still here. Other Bigfoot, they were watching him. He couldn't shake the feeling that they knew. They knew what he had done, both the rescue and the subsequent tragic capture. Were they judging him? Were they grieving? Or were they, perhaps, sensing his profound remorse, his deep regret, and even his nascent fierce determination to somehow rectify his mistake? The thought that they might be observing him, understanding the turmoil within him, sent shivers down his spine, but not of fear. It was a recognition, a validation of the profound connection he had felt with the captive female. The silence of the woods began to speak to him in a new language, one of watchful eyes and shared sorrow. He was no longer merely a human in their territory. He was, in some strange, inexplicable way, implicated in their fate. The profound secret he held, the truth of the Bigfoot's existence and their vulnerability, weighed on him like a physical burden. He understood now, with a chilling clarity, the vast implications for humanity. This wasn't just about a hidden species. It was about the very nature of discovery, about humanity's destructive impulse, and the tragic consequences that often followed when the unknown was confronted with fear and exploitation rather than awe and understanding. His scientific detachment had shattered, replaced by a fierce, undeniable personal responsibility. He knew, with every fiber of his being, that he could not, would not, let this truth remain buried. His new resolve hardened, forged in guilt, and tempered by a burgeoning fierce hope. He would fight for her, and for them. The immediate conflict of the Bigfoot's capture, the raw injustice of it all, remained agonizingly unresolved, a gaping wound in Ethan's conscience. He knew, with a chilling certainty, that the creature he had helped free, only for her to be seized, was now subjected to a fate far worse than the snare. Her freedom was gone, her ancient peace shattered, and her very existence likely relegated to a sterile laboratory or a secret military facility, dissected and analyzed for whatever secrets her unique physiology might hold. This knowledge fueled a profound transformation within him, shifting him from a detached scientific observer to an impassioned, resolute guardian. His personal journey, ignited by that harrowing encounter, now burned with an unyielding purpose. He dedicated himself, with an intensity that surprised even himself, to protecting the remaining undocumented wildlife in the region. His research became not just academic, but an active, covert mission. He understood, with crystal clarity, that if one Bigfoot had been found, others surely existed, and they too were now in grave peril. His cabin, once a sanctuary for solitary study, now became a nerve center for a silent, desperate fight. He meticulously documented every unusual sound, every snapped branch, every oversized footprint that defied conventional explanation. He installed new, more sophisticated motion-activated cameras, not to catch poachers, but to monitor for any signs of military incursions, any hint of their return. He became a shadow in the forest, moving with a newfound stealth, his every sense attuned to the subtle rhythms of the wild, searching for any indication of the continued presence of the elusive species he now knew existed. His scientific network, previously a source for professional discourse, became a tool for subterfuge. He subtly probed, asked hypothetical questions, hinting at ecological anomalies and undocumented species, carefully avoiding any direct mention of what he had witnessed. The stonewalling he encountered, the sudden silences from colleagues, the vaguely worded warnings he had received, only solidified his conviction. They knew. Some of them, at least, knew or suspected, and were either part of the cover-up or too afraid to speak. This gave him a grim satisfaction, confirming that his fight was against a system, not just an isolated incident. Ethan's primary objective became exposing the truth, not just about the specific capture, but about the very existence of these creatures and the implications of humanity's aggressive encroachment into their ancient domains. He knew it would be a long, arduous fight, fraught with danger, potentially costing him his career, his reputation, perhaps even his life. But the intelligent, sorrowful eyes of the female Bigfoot, burned into his memory, left him no other choice. He began meticulously gathering evidence, not just for scientific journals, but for a public awakening. He compiled satellite imagery data, cross-referenced reported sightings with environmental disturbances, and started building a case, piece by painstaking piece, against the narrative of denial and secrecy. He started subtly influencing local conservation groups, guiding their efforts towards protecting untouched expanses of forest that he suspected were vital habitats for these hidden beings. He became an advocate for stricter environmental protections, not just for the known species, but for the unknown, for the possibility that there was so much more to the natural world than humanity had dared to acknowledge. Ranger, ever by his side, seemed to sense the shift in his human companion. The dog's attentiveness sharpened, his barks no longer merely territorial, but imbued with a watchful, protective quality, as if he too understood the gravity of their new mission. Ethan stood at the edge of the forest, the sprawling canvas of ancient trees stretching out before him, a verdant ocean of secrets. The sun, a muted silver disk through the canopy, cast long, dancing shadows that seemed to whisper of things unseen, of lives lived just beyond the veil of human perception. He was no longer the detached biologist, meticulously cataloging and classifying. He was a guardian, bound by an unspoken oath, a silent promise etched into the very core of his being. He felt a deep, almost spiritual responsibility to the creature he had saved, however briefly, and to the entire species she represented. The weight of that responsibility was immense, but it was also a source of strength, forging a steely resolve within him. The solemn promise in his heart was clear. He would not rest until the truth was revealed, until these magnificent, elusive beings were recognized, respected, and protected. He understood that humanity, in its relentless pursuit of progress and control, often blinded itself to the wonders and mysteries that still thrived in the wild places. His encounter had shattered his own preconceptions, forced him to confront the limits of scientific understanding, and opened his eyes to a world far richer and more complex than he had ever imagined. The forest, once merely his laboratory, was now a sacred trust. He took a deep breath, the scent of pine and damp earth filling his lungs, and stepped forward, ready for the long, uncertain fight ahead. A solitary warrior in defense of the greatest secret of the wild. If this extraordinary story of a biologist's chance encounter and his transformation into a reluctant protector touched you as deeply as it touched Ethan, please like this video and share it with everyone you know. Let's spread awareness and ignite a conversation about the mysteries that still lie hidden in our world. And for more untold tales of the wild, the mysterious, and the profound connections that bind us to the natural world, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you don't miss out on our next gripping video.